सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Some dramatic developments have taken place on the battlefront in Ukraine. Now, for some time, we haven't talked about Ukraine because it looked like the battlefront had gotten frozen or had gotten ossified, with both sides mostly firing artillery at each other. So there was this long distance warfare and it looked like no side was particularly making a movement. Now, over the past 5 days, beginning last Tuesday night, in fact, so maybe 6 days by the time you see this, a dramatic change has taken place. And that change is that Ukraine, which had been on the defensive so far, and you might say that, look, Russians came right up to Kyiv and they were driven back, so how can you say Ukraine was on the defensive? But the fact is, that was a defensive battle. In that battle, Russians came in with their heavy stuff, tanks, armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, artillery, etc., very close to Kyiv because they thought they were going to face a walkover. And then what happened was that Ukrainians waged a kind of guerrilla warfare with anti-tank missiles and drones over them, and they suffered such heavy damage that they retreated. So that was a victory for the Ukrainians earlier, but that was a victory through a defensive fight back. Now the opposite has happened. Now the opposite thing that's happened is that Ukrainians are now attacking. They are the aggressors in a counter offense. So aggressors not as in attacking another country, but aggressors as in attacking entrenched forces of a foreign occupier in their country. So this is, to steal a line from old late Saddam Hussein, this is the mother of all counterattacks. Now for a country which has the armed forces fraction of the size of the aggressor, has now launched a very audacious and a massive counterattack. So this is the case of, remember that line, Shikari khud yahan shikar ho gaya. That is, the hunter has become the hunted. So the Russians have become the hunted. They've become the defenders now, and they've not proven to be very good defenders, at least in this round. In fact, they are on the run, they are vacating large areas, and this is not something that now you can blame on propaganda. Although most of the media we read is Western media for sure, but the fact is that now everything is covered by satellites and drones, and you have pictures available, and you have a lot of dynamic data available, a lot of electronics available, videos available. So maybe in deference to that, the Russian Defense Ministry itself has made certain admissions, and they've said war. They've said, first of all, in their own briefing, Russian Defense Ministry's briefing, they have shown a map that displays areas that they have vacated or which Ukraine has recovered or recaptured. So they've shown on their maps, Russian Defense Ministry is showing that their troops and units have drawn to the west of what is called as the Oskil River. Now, if you look at the map of Ukraine, see the map of Ukraine, it's mostly a country of flat plains, right? On the map of Ukraine, you will find the river Dnieper, or the Dnipro as it's called in local language. That one pretty much bisects the country north to south until it ends in the Black Sea. Now there are two more rivers east of Dnipro, and these are rivers Seversky Donetsk and Oskil. Now a lot of the fighting has taken place in the expanse of flat land leading up to these rivers. So Seversky Donetsk comes first, and then comes Oskil. Russian forces now, which had come to the other side of Seversky Donetsk, they have now pulled back. Other side means to the west of Seversky Donetsk. They have now pulled back to the other side, that is east of Oskil River. That's what the Russian Defense Ministry map shows. The Russian Defense Ministry also says that, look, we are on the eastern edge because In the previous day, we have now withdrawn from cities of or the townships of Balaklia, Izium. Now, Izium is very important. Izium is where a lot of the rail lines and highways in this heart of Ukraine, or in this heart of sort of in the Donbas area abutting Ukrainian mainland, that's where a lot of the rail lines and highways meet. So Izium is a kind of nerve center, a kind of the heart of this region logistically, where a lot of these arteries meet. So this is what sort of in jargon, in military jargon, would be called GLOC. So what is GLOC? That is ground line of communication. So Izium has been taken, and couple of other such centers which snap the Russian army's ground line of communication or GLOC have been taken. Kupiansk has been taken, Balaklia has been taken. You can see some of these on the map. So what has happened as a result is that Russian forces are now afraid of being surrounded. And in that fear, it's also a prudent military move. If you see a prospect of being encircled, it's best to avoid getting encircled than having to find ways to fight your way through encirclement. So right now they seem to be withdrawing, and Russian Defense Ministry has also said, in fact the Russian general in charge, General Shoigu, said the other day that he had decided, that his army had decided to withdraw and regroup in eastern Donbas in more defendable areas. So what that means is they are now vacating large territories in Luhansk and also some in Donetsk, in the hope that they will be able to defend the rest of Donetsk better. Now see this map of Ukraine. Now we rely for this analysis greatly on the study done by Institute of the Study of War, and these are the institute's tweets. So in one of those tweets, it shows areas which the Russia already occupied in Ukraine. That is going back to 2014 when they took Crimea and some other areas. Then in some areas, they were Russian partisans working with local pro-Russia groups, and they had occupied some territories, and also separately the territories the Russians occupied after the post-February 24 offensive. It also shows area where Russian hold is tenuous, where Russian hold has been strong, and also areas which Ukrainians have recovered in this 1 week counter-attack, this spectacular and audacious 1 week counter-attack. Now, as area goes, this is about, I'd say, 2,000 to 3,000 square kilometers. So it's not that much area that the Ukrainians have reoccupied, considering that Russians are sitting on about 120,000 square kilometers of Ukrainian area. But you know what? These are flat lands. These are not mountains where you have to slog mile by mile. There in the plains, if you have a breakthrough and the other side is escaping, other side is not fighting, morale breaks, then ground can change hands very rapidly, because there are no frequent mountain ranges or rivers where you can set up defensive positions and delay the advancing forces. This is precisely what happened when the Russians came in. Ukrainians did not have, it's also true that they did not yet have the wherewithal. They've got a lot of tamjam and samagri from the West, especially Americans after that, but also they did not have that much space and time and that much of topographical features to slow down the Russians. Now Russians are facing the same problem. Once again, look at the situation in the heart of Ukraine. This is the heart of Ukraine. If you look at the heart of Ukraine, and for simplicity, you might just draw a straight line from north to the south. So north, say on the Russian border, not far from Kharkiv, say about 60, 70 miles or maybe 100 kilometers from Kharkiv. The second biggest city in Ukraine. So Belgorod is a Russian border town. That's a town where some mysterious Mi-17s had once dropped some bombs and set fire to one of the ammunition dumps on its airbase. Now, if you draw a straight line for simplicity to the Black Sea, north to south, that is where this fighting is going on, and you can see that there are different manifestations of this fighting. In the very north, it's the Ukrainians who are on the offensive or counter-offensive If you draw the straight line from Belgorod, say to the mouths of the Dnieper opening into Black Sea, that's the port town of Kherson. Kherson, by the way, is the only provincial capital or only headquarters of an oblast, as they would call it in Russia and Ukraine as well. That's been captured by the Russians through this offensive, after this offensive. So if you come from Belgorod to Kherson, it's about 640, 645 kilometers if you drive. Now along that are various sections of fighting. So in the very north, a fair bit of stretch of the north, say 100 plus kilometers, 150 kilometers, Ukrainians have pushed through and they're pushing deeper. So you can see that expanse of blue which shows territory recovered by Ukraine, that is expanding, and that is expanding at so rapid a rate that if I read even the Western media, a lot of the experts are getting worried. They think that Ukrainian advance is so rapid that maybe they'll be enveloped in a counter offensive by the Russians, because Russians have the wherewithal. So if they could gather the willpower again, they could once again envelop them. And second, you are suddenly taking so much territory. Do you have the troops then to hold that territory? Because you know what? In war, particularly when you are in the offensive, when you're taking territory and terrain consume troops, they consume militaries, they consume troops, they consume equipment, they consume intelligence, they consume electronic resources, everything, because you have to hold territory. The counter argument to that is that after all, Ukraine is only recovering its own territory, where civilians by and large are not just friendly to it, not just non-hostile to it, but also very loyal to it, and will be helpful and help defend their territory instead of allowing a fifth column to develop, or instead of allowing Russians attacks from other sides. So all that is up in the air. In fact, even the Ukrainian defense minister himself has said, and I quote him, "A counter-offensive liberates territory, and after that you have to control it and be ready to defend it." So it's not as if the battle is over. It's not as if the battle has taken a decisive turn and now it can only end in defeat for the Russians. But what's happened is a big setback for the Russians, so big that Russians themselves are forced to acknowledge it. In fact, as you've seen with Ukrainians, they are very good with psychological warfare and propaganda. So a whole bunch of memes are coming out. So there is one meme where you see a lot of the Ukrainians obviously watching in a hall on a giant screen. You see the map changing, map of the battlefield changing as their troops are advancing, and you see celebrations. In another, you also see the Russian general, it's an actual footage, explaining away this withdrawal, saying that this is a tactical retreat. We are just withdrawing from these lightly held areas to regroup and consolidate in a more defendable area. It's a tactics or a strategy, right? And there again, people are cheering. This has made a difference to the larger strategic picture as well. Strategic means politico-diplomatic strategic picture. What's happened there is the Ukrainians are now saying, Ukrainian defense minister has said, look, there will no longer be a peace deal based on status quo. So it's not as if ceasefire, you stay where you are, we stay where we are recovering our territory. So we cannot have a peace deal or talks unless the Russians not only leave all our territory, including Crimea, by the way, which they took in 2014, and after which they held a referendum in Crimea, obviously a referendum with Russian characteristics, where they got maybe 90% plus affirmation for becoming part of Russia. So they say they have to leave all Ukrainian territory as internationally acknowledged, including Crimea, and also agree to pay Ukraine war reparations. So that is how the mood on the Ukrainian side has changed. On the Russian side, again you see Sergei Lavrov, who's a familiar face and a familiar voice. On the Russian side, he has said, and it's a very interesting line, he said, we were never against talks. We are not against talks. We never refused talks. And he says, look, the longer Ukrainians delay holding the talks, the tougher it will be for us to find a resolution. That is a big shift from what he's been saying so far. So far, Russians have been putting their preconditions. that you accept our preconditions, blah, 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 denazify, de-westernize, commit to not joining NATO, etc., and then we will talk. This is a change. Once again, this is, I won't say early days, but at the same time, I won't say it's a decisive big turn, but it's a major shift in a shifting battlefront. Once again, I take you to the battlefront, and this 640 kilometers plus front along the Dnieper River. Now, if you see this, you see a lot of fighting on the north, that is where Ukrainians are pushing in eastwards, driving the Russians away. Then you see quite a bit of fighting in extreme south, but the area of fighting is intense, but not that large longitudinally. What's happening there is that the town of Kherson, which is a town of about 250,000 people, which in European terms is not a small town, it's a sizable town. That town is the only one, I told you just now, the only provincial capital that the Russians had occupied after the war began, after they launched the attack. This is a very crucial town. Not only is a big prestigious town, but it's also the only property of any size that they've gone and occupied the other side of Dnieper River, the Dnieper River. That is on the western side. So it's a Russian foothold on the western side of the river, a kind of enclave. If they lose that means in any case they are not on this side, and this is an important port on Black Sea, because this is at the mouth of the Dnieper River where it meets Black Sea. So once again a crucial place. Also if the Ukrainians get there, if they occupy this, then they get closer as a missile flies or as long-range artillery flies, they get closer to Crimea, because their target ultimately in this area is Crimea. Also, it gives them a foothold. Once they can cross the river, it gives them a foothold now to launch yet another attack on Mariupol. Mariupol, remember, is a very prestigious target. Another port city. There was a big fighting there. We had 2 episodes of Karta Clutter on that, and that is where the last stand was made by the Azov battalion in the Azovstal steel plant. Now that is something again that the Russians are worrying about. So since this morning, we've been seeing videos of long columns of Russian troops or troop carriers and armored vehicles moving into Mariupol. So Russians may be preparing to defend it. At the same time, they have to worry about Kherson, because they have nearly 3,000 troops in Kherson locked up in defenders' positions, and they are now being cut off, because you know what? Kherson, as you can see on the river, is the west of the river. They are connected with what might be called the mainland now, as far as the Russians are concerned, connected with it by a bunch of bridges. All those bridges have been damaged or brought down. So maybe when the last bridge comes down, the Russians put together one more pontoon bridge, and within hours, the Ukrainians take it down as well. So this city's defense is now under deep pressure. Russians are defending very hard. So the progress in this area for the Ukrainians is more like a plodding operation, where they are also taking a lot of casualties. Remember, the attacker takes a lot of casualties because attacker is exposed. And the Ukrainians obviously are taking casualties. We've now also begun to see videos of burning Ukrainian tanks, abandoned Ukrainian tanks and infantry fighting vehicles. They are getting caught in ambushes, because when you attack, you are exposed, and yet they are pressing on. Now, what's happened on this entire battlefront is that think of a battlefront like a balloon. So what happens with the balloon? A balloon with air inside it. Like if you press the balloon on one side, it usually bulges on the other side. What the Russians did was, when initially the Ukrainians began pressing the balloon at the bottom, that is on the southern side at Kherson, the Russians started doing a little bit of activity in the north, as if they were trying to make moves on Kharkiv. But the fact is that ploy did not work, because Ukrainians now have very good access to intelligence. And as Ukrainians increase pressure on Kherson, instead of consolidating or bringing in, stocking more ammunition and bringing more forces in the north to reopen that front, to get the Ukrainians to shift attention and equipment and men back there, it is the Russians, because Ukrainians knew that Russians don't quite have the wherewithal yet. It will take them a long time to have enough to threaten Kharkiv in the north. that Russians, as pressure on Kherson grew, Russians began withdrawing or shifting some of the units from the north to Kherson. So what did the Ukrainians do? They grabbed the balloon at the other end. So they've grabbed this balloon at the northern end and at the southern end. So Russians in turn are getting pushed backwards. Again, imagine a balloon which you're pressing from here and pressing from there, the pressure will go on the other side. And that's why Russians have their backs to the wall and they are being pushed back. Now let us see what they will do. It's nobody's case that Russians will not have an answer or Russians don't know how to deal with these situations. Russia's history is replete with examples of them taking setbacks, taking massive casualties, massive losses, and then coming back. That's how they fought Hitler, that's how they fought many other wars in the past. Russians have enormous amount of stoicism, but the question is right now, do they have the moral strength, motivation? Because a lot of the Russian troops might be asking, and some of these are coming out, frankly, the truth to tell, from prisoners of war taken by Ukrainians. Today you have a situation in this psychological war where Zelensky, Ukrainian president, is making televised appeals to Russian soldiers to surrender and promising them full Geneva Convention treatment, right? So the mood in the battle has shifted a little bit. And a lot of these videos that are now coming out, these Russian soldiers, in fact, a lot of the villagers are also talking about this. Russian soldiers said, look, I am here, I am not your enemy. In fact, I see a story in the Washington Post today where in the north, from the lot of the quote-unquote liberated villages, villagers are saying, look, these troops told us we have no enmity with you, and they were quite well behaved because they said you are people like us, also because they also figured that they were vulnerable, and now they've run away, many of them have run away, leaving their arms, not just tanks and artillery guns, but even ordinary rifles, getting into civilian clothes, stealing bicycles from local population, and they've melted back. So Russians are now under pressure on all directions, and we need to see what Russians will do. Under how much pressure are the Russians, and how big a setback is this for Russians? First of all, we have a statement from Igor Girkin. Igor Girkin has compared this setback with the 1905 Battle of Mukden. Who's Igor Girkin? Igor Girkin is a former Russian military and intelligence officer who had spearheaded the takeover or the grab of Crimean Peninsula. And after that happened, he had organized the militant groups fighting the Ukrainians in the Donbas region. In August of 2014, he was fired by the Russians. Even Russians saw the need to fire them. Just after MH17, Malaysian Airlines' big airliner with 298 passengers, was shot down obviously by an S-300 missile fired by one of the units under his partisans' control. Now, he has said this is like the Battle of Mukden. What is the Battle of Mukden? Battle of Mukden is a 1905 battle, the biggest land battle in modern times until then. Modern times means since the guns and artillery came into the picture, and that was fought in Manchuria, which is today Shenyang in China and capital of China's Liaoning province. And in that battle, very bloody, very expensive battle, the Japanese had inflicted a decisive defeat on the Russians. By the way, as someone else pointed out, one of the Western experts pointed out, this was also the battle defeat that sparked the Russian Revolution. So once again, a lot of people think that this might lead to a fall of Putin if this continues like that, but there's a long way to go there. I will share with you an article also by Anne Applebaum, who was a reputed American columnist, analyst, writer who I read regularly. And this is an article in The Atlantic where she says that it's time to think about a Ukrainian victory and maybe Putin's fall as a consequence. The other bit of evidence we have is from Ramzan Kadyrov. He's also a character we are familiar with. You see his picture here. Ramzan Kadyrov is a leader from Chechnya. Now, we know that the Russians, Putin's army fought a big bloody war in Chechnya. Then he gave over power in Chechnya to Ramzan Kadyrov, who's a Chechnyan also who fought on the Russian side. Now, Ramzan Kadyrov's army, who are loosely called Kadyrovites, they've been fighting in Ukraine Sometimes in the front, they've carried out some of the worst atrocities. They were also there in Mariupol. Now, Ramzan Kadyrov, who heads this, he has said very interestingly, he has said, and I quote, "I will be forced to speak to the leadership of Defense Ministry and the leadership of the country to explain the real situation on the ground." And then he adds, it's very interesting situation. It's extremely astonishing. Having said that, I will conclude with a rhetorical flourish from Zelensky himself, who said, as he saw his forces moving forward rapidly, much more rapidly than they had imagined. He says, and I quote, "Read my lips, without water or without you." What he means is the option, are you telling me to either live without water or live without you? So without water or without, so without water or without you, without you. Without light or without you, without you. Without food or without you, without you. Cold, hunger, darkness and thirst are not as frightening and deadly for us as your friendship and brotherhood. But history will put everything in its place and we will be with gas, light, water and food. And without you. So this is the stage that we have now reached in this war, almost exactly on its 200th day. This is not how Putin had scripted it to be. Putin thought it will be over like a special military operation in 3 or 4 days. But now he's in deep trouble at this point as we talk.